One of the fundamental questions of philosophy for more than 2,000 years is the question of God's existence. Does God exist? On the one hand, you have people who say yes. They answer the question, yes, God exists. And on the other hand, you have people who say no, there is no God. And it goes back and forth. Who's right and who's wrong? In 1945, a philosopher at Oxford named John Wisdom wrote an essay called Gods, in which he tells a parable of the garden. That's what I want to talk about today, and we'll see how that relates to the question of God. It's a very short essay. You can read it in several minutes, but basically you can break it up. If you go through it systematically, you can break it up into about 10 parts. So that's what I'll do here. I'll just go through it, and then I'll talk about the significance of it. The first part is two people return to their long neglected garden and find among the weeds some plants doing really well. Second part is one says, it must be that a gardener is coming and taking care of the garden. 3, they ask the neighbors if they've ever seen the gardener, and no one has. Step 4, the person who believes the gardener is coming says, well, he must have worked while they were asleep. Step 5, the other person says, no, someone would have heard him. Even if they were asleep, they would have heard the gardener. And anyway, any gardener would have taken care of the weeds. So it doesn't look like there's a garden. Step 6, the person who believes in the gardener says, but look at the design. Look at the flowers. It looks like there's design here. It suggests the gardener is taking care of it, and he must be invisible. If nobody's ever seen him, he's invisible. And the more we look, if we keep looking further, we'll find more confirmation of this hypothesis. Step 7, they both examine the garden more carefully, and they come across other evidence that suggests there is no gardener. And they actually come across some things in the garden that suggest that if there is a gardener, he must be malicious. He must be evil. So this continues on. They both continues. They study everything they can about gardens. They become experts. They examine the garden carefully. They get to the point where they know all the facts. They know everything about gardens. They're both experts. They don't disagree about what to expect. They've studied all up on what happens to neglected gardens. So they've gotten to the point where they agree about all the facts. No one knows anything the other person doesn't know, and yet they still disagree as to whether a gardener is coming. One person says a gardener is coming and taking care of the garden. The other person says, no, there's no garden. At this point, John Wisdom says, what's the hypothesis? At this point, the hypothesis that a gardener is coming has ceased to be experimental. That means there's no facts that are going to change, that are going to make us believe one way or the other. An experimental hypothesis that you can check. You can do some experiments with. You can actually look at the world and see if the hypothesis is a good hypothesis or a bad hypothesis. The two people have come to the point, Wisdom says, where the hypothesis that a gardener is coming has ceased to be experimental. And yet they disagree as to whether a gardener is coming. The question at this point, this is step 9, is Wisdom says, what is the difference between them at this point? The difference between them is how they feel about the garden. It's not over any facts. And then the last step in his argument, in his little parable, is that if this is the only difference between the two as to how they feel about the garden, then does it make any sense is it any longer appropriate to ask which is right? Who's right and who's reasonable? It's a rhetorical question, and wisdom's the implication is that at this stage in the investigation, it's no longer appropriate to ask who's right, which who's reasonable. They both disagree about the gardener. One person says the gardener is coming, the other person says there isn't a gardener. As applied to the question of God, the garden is a symbol for the world. The weeds are a symbol for the evil in the world. All the things in the world suffering, suffering tremendous evil, suffering things that, just that the weeds that you like wonder, well, if there is a God who cares about the world, why does God allow all this evil, all this suffering? And yet these are the weeds. And yet there are people who know the people who believe in God and people who do not believe in God, they all agree on the facts. I mean, if you believe in God, you realize that there's a lot of evil in the world, a lot of suffering that we cannot explain. So people who believe in God, and people who don't believe in God, they agree on all the facts. They agree on all the facts, and yet they come to a different conclusion. Some people believe behind it all, there's a gardener, there's God. Other people say, no, there is no garden. And wisdom is saying that the difference between believers in God and people who don't believe in God, it's not a matter of fact. It's not the hypothesis. He calls it a hypothesis. The hypothesis that God exists, wisdom is saying, is not an experimental hypothesis. It's not something we can go out and test. Scientific hypotheses are experimental. You can go out and test them. You can do an experiment. If it turns out one way, the experiment will be confirmed or at least not falsified. And if the results turn out to be another way, you can falsify the hypothesis and eliminate it. The question of God, does God exist? Is there a God who watches over the world like in the way that a gardener watches over the garden? Is there a God? Does God exist? At least in this, he's talking about the God, the theistic God, the God that Christianity talks about, the God of Judaism, the God of Islam. Does this God, omnipotent, omniscient, all-loving God, exist? That's the question. Now, one way of looking at it is that, well, either the answer is yes or no. If God does exist and you say God exists, then you're right. If God exists and you say God doesn't exist, then you're wrong. Somebody's right and somebody's wrong. Wisdom is approaching it from the standpoint of what's called emotivism. I'll write that word down because it became really a popular view in the 20th century, in the mid-20th century, called emotivism. And the emotivism, when it comes to religious language, is the view that religious language is not factual language. It's not about facts. It's about religious statements for wisdom, and the emotivist view of language is that religious statements are emotive in character. That means they're about how we feel. They express attitudes. And when it comes to ethics, there's a whole movement also in ethics, emotivism in ethics, which is very similar to the one in religion, dealing with religious statements. Emotivism and ethics is the view that there are no objective moral facts. Ethical statements are simply a matter of different attitudes, but there's no fact about the matter. Like there is a fact about the matter, 2 and 2 is 4, 2 plus 2 equals 4. That is a factual, there's a fact about it, either yes or no. It's raining outside, that's a factual statement. But when it comes to like, is murder wrong? Okay, is stealing wrong? These are ethical questions, and there's no fact about the matter. There's different, but we do express different attitudes towards it. The same thing occurs in religious when it comes to religion. Emotivism and religion is the view that religious statements are not factual statements, And that's what John Wisdom says that at when he gets to the point where he says the both people know all the facts about the garden, and yet they disagree as to whether a gardener is coming. And he says at this point, the question has ceased to be experimental. The hypothesis has ceased to be experimental because there's no way you can falsify the belief that the gardener is coming, uh, because the person says, well, the gardener is invisible. Well, you can't refute that. It, Scientific statements you can refute, but religious statements, wisdom is saying you cannot refute. So anyway, it's a very interesting essay. The the problem with this is that most people who disagree, I mean, and people disagree vehemently about does God exist. Nowadays, for example, for the last 20 years, the question of whether God exists has become a major issue. People like the new atheists, people like Richard Dawkins and Hitchens and people like that, are going around, expressing their anti-religious views and arguing against God's existence, and then other people are arguing that God does exist. So the debate today has become very vehement, and the people who are debating the issue believe they're debating a factual issue. The atheists believe that they are right, that there is no God. The Christians and the Jews and the Muslims are, on the other hand, are arguing that they are right, that it is a fact that God exists. Okay, so the people who actually debate the issue believe that there is a fact at issue, and they would really think that John Wisdom is totally off the mark. Wisdom's view is that the people who are debating God, some people think they're right, some people think they're wrong. Wisdom is, what his view would be, that uh, it's much to do about nothing. I mean, what's the argument about? Really, they're not arguing about any factual issue. They're just it's just a disagreement over feeling, how they feel towards the world. People feel towards the garden or towards the world in such a way that they talk about God. There's a loving God that looks over things. Other people don't believe that there's a God. They don't believe there's a gardener. So they look at the world. They feel one way towards the world. Other people feel another way towards the world. They feel differently about the world. That's wisdom's view. It's not the question, does God exist, for wisdom is not a factual issue. It's a question of emotions. Now that view, I think that view has really kind of petered out. You very rarely do you meet people that believe that anymore. But that was a view dominant for a long time in the mid 20th century, at least among philosophers. I personally don't think I think it's wrong. It doesn't, to me, it doesn't make sense. I believe that when people are arguing about does God exist, I think there is an answer to the question. Either the God of Christianity or Judaism, Islam, either that God does exist or the God doesn't exist. Somebody's right and somebody's wrong. That's how I think about it. Wisdom's view is that the issue is not, it's no longer reason, it's not appropriate to ask whether, which one is reasonable, or which view is reasonable, which one's right. That's the emotivist view of religious language. So when you ask the question, does God exist? People like John Wisdom would say, there's no answer to that, because it's a misleading question. It's not a factual question. What's going on is it's a matter of, you're dealing with people who disagree. It's a matter of taste. Some people feel one way, some people feel the other way. No one's right, no one's wrong. That's the emotivist view of language. That's what's the view that's being expressed in this essay, Gods, by John Wisdom. So it's up to you. What do you think about it? But I personally think it's not I personally believe that there is an answer to it. Either somebody's right or somebody's wrong. But Wisdom's view is that that's wrong, and that's simply a matter of feeling. And we'll be looking at other approaches in the chapter, but I wanted to start out with the wisdom essay.